30 August 1945, the Pacific Ocean stretched vast and gray, its endless surface shimmering under a pale, overcast sky. The water lay calm, smoothed by a gentle wind that whispered of peace after years of turmoil. The war, a relentless storm that had consumed nations, had finally drawn to a close, leaving a fragile silence in its wake. On the weathered deck of a U.S. Navy transport ship, a group of Japanese women stood clustered together, their thin clothes offering little protection against the chilly sea air. Their eyes were wide with uncertainty, their bodies swaying in rhythm with the rolling waves, as if tethered to the ocean's unpredictable pulse. Some were nurses, captured on remote Pacific islands where battles had raged fiercely. Others were office workers or ordinary civilians swept up in the chaotic tide of Japan's surrender. Their faces, pale and drawn, bore the weight of exhaustion, framed by dark hair tied back in careless knots, a reflection of a nation broken by defeat. They had grown up surrounded by propaganda posters and pamphlets that painted Americans as vicious monsters, grotesque creatures with sharp claws and jagged teeth, ready to devour their enemies. Yet now, standing on this foreign ship, they were guarded by young men in crisp, neatly pressed uniforms, men who spoke in strange accents, their voices unfamiliar but not harsh. These soldiers didn't yell or strike them. Instead, they offered cigarettes or sips of water, treating the women not as hated enemies, but as ordinary people caught in the same vast web of war. The women could hardly reconcile this reality with the terrifying tales drilled into them for years, tales that had shaped their fears and fueled their nightmares. The ship creaked and groaned as it carved its path through the ocean, sailing toward the distant American coast, carrying not just passengers but the heavy burden of surrender across the sea. At first, the women were silent, standing close to one another, their breaths visible in the cool morning air, mingling with the salty mist. Some clutched worn bags, their contents meager but precious, faded photographs of loved ones, a carefully folded kimono tucked beneath rough army blankets, or small trinkets that held memories of home. Each woman carried not only these physical belongings, but also a personal story of survival, a testament to how she had endured capture in the final, chaotic days of the war. One, a 28-year-old nurse, had worked in a makeshift hospital on Saipan, where she witnessed friends leap from cliffs into the sea, choosing death over capture by the Americans they'd been taught to fear. Another, barely 21, had been typing reports in a garrison office when U.S. troops surrounded her island, her world collapsing in a matter of hours. A third, older than the others, had been tending to children in a missionary compound when the wave of surrender swept them all into captivity. Their paths to this moment were different, yet they shared a common dread, a gnawing fear of what awaited them in the land of their enemy, a place they had been taught to despise. The American men aboard the ship were young, many no older than the women themselves, their faces still carrying the softness of youth despite their roles as sailors and guards. They hailed from diverse corners of the United States, cornfields in Iowa, steel mills in Pennsylvania, baseball diamonds in Texas, ordinary lives transformed by the demands of war. They moved across the deck with a quiet confidence, their rifles slung loosely over their shoulders, their smiles flickering when they caught the women's cautious glances. One soldier, his expression light with amusement, offered a cigarette, tapping the pack with 2 fingers before extending it toward a woman, his gesture as casual as if he were offering it to a friend. The women hesitated, their instincts screaming that it might be a trap, a cruel trick to lure them into vulnerability. But when one finally accepted, her hands trembling as she reached out, the soldier simply nodded and struck a match to light it for her. It was a small, almost insignificant act, yet it pierced through the wall of fear they had been taught to uphold for years. These were not the monsters of their propaganda posters, they were just men, and that realization was profoundly unsettling, shaking the very foundations of their beliefs. The journey across the Pacific was long, and time aboard the ship blurred into a haze of routine and uncertainty. Meals arrived at regular intervals, trays laden with bread, steaming bowls of soup, and sometimes even meat, a stark contrast to the meager rations the women had known in war-torn Japan. They were stunned by the abundance, their eyes wide at the sight of such plenty, though some could not bring themselves to eat, their stomachs knotted with anxiety and disbelief. The nights were cold, the bunks hard and unforgiving, and the darkness was filled with the soft whispers of the women as they tried to make sense of their destination. Rumors circulated among them, perhaps they were headed to California, or maybe Texas, names that sounded exotic and impossibly vast, places they had never seen but had heard described as lands of arrogance, towering skyscrapers, and endless machines. To imagine themselves in such a place, after years of air raids, food shortages, and the constant threat of bombs, felt as impossible as dreaming of peace itself. Yet the most unsettling realization was not the fear of what lay ahead, but the presence of the Americans themselves. Compared to the men they had known in Japan, emaciated by rice shortages, their faces hollowed by years of conflict and deprivation, the Americans seemed impossibly tall, their shoulders broad, their bodies radiating vitality. Their uniforms fit snugly, tailored to their strong frames, their boots polished to a shine that caught the light, their laughter rising above the howl of the wind across the deck. The women observed them in secret, their astonishment growing with each glance at their healthy, robust forms. They had been told Americans were decadent, weak, softened by lives of luxury and excess. But these men, with their clear, bright eyes and athletic builds, were anything but weak. The contradiction gnawed at them, a silent wound that challenged everything they had been taught to believe about their enemy. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of burning red and soft orange, the nurse from Saipan stood alone at the ship's railing, her gaze fixed on the glowing line where the water met the sky. A young American sailor, barely older than 20, stood a few steps away, a cigarette glowing faintly between his fingers. For a long time they shared the silence, two figures from opposing worlds, separated by language and history, yet bound by the shared space of the ship. When the sailor finally spoke, his voice was gentle, almost shy, carrying a warmth that transcended words. "You'll be safe there." She couldn't understand the English, but the softness in his tone, the absence of menace, carried a meaning she felt deeply. It was not hatred or threat, but something that might have been kindness. Unsettled by the humanity in his voice, she turned away quickly, her heart racing with confusion at how human, how ordinary he seemed. Inside the cramped cabins below deck, the women's conversations grew bolder as the days passed. One young woman, her voice barely above a whisper, confided that the guards reminded her of actors from American films she had glimpsed in secret before the war, their faces sharp and charismatic. Another admitted that their smiles, so open and unguarded, felt almost frightening in their freedom, as if they belonged to a world untouched by the suffering she knew. A third, her voice tinged with unease, said the tall soldiers made her feel small, like a child standing in their shadow. Their nervous laughter echoed softly, but beneath it lay a deeper worry, a creeping doubt that shook the foundations of their worldview. If everything they had been told about the Americans was false, what else was a lie? If the enemy was not grotesque but handsome, not vicious but courteous, then what had all their suffering, the years of loss, fear, and sacrifice, been for? Their minds wrestled with questions too heavy to answer, questions that lingered like the salt in the air. The days passed, marked by the ship's bells, the regular arrival of meals, and the endless hiss of the ocean against the hull. Slowly, the women began to adjust, though fear never fully left them, lingering like a shadow. They noticed small details now, the way the Americans teased each other with easy camaraderie, the way one soldier whistled a cheerful tune while polishing his boots, the way another knelt in quiet prayer at night, his head bowed in reverence. These ordinary acts, so mundane in their simplicity, felt extraordinary to the women, who had been prepared for cruelty and instead found glimpses of everyday life. It was disarming, confusing, and deeply painful, for it reminded them of their own brothers, husbands, and fathers, men who might have shared such moments of normalcy if the war had not consumed their world, leaving only ashes and memories. On the morning of August 30th, a faint line appeared on the horizon, gradually sharpening into the unmistakable shape of the American coastline. The women pressed against the rails, their hearts pounding with a mix of dread and curiosity. For some, fear surged anew. What trials awaited them in this vast, unknown land of their enemy? For others, a spark of curiosity flickered, a desire to see the place they had only heard of in whispers and warnings. The tall guards stood nearby, gazing toward their homeland with relaxed postures, as if returning from a long day's work rather than the end of a global war. The contrast was almost unbearable, a stark reminder of the chasm between their worlds. The prisoners were crossing into a land they had been taught to hate, a land that now held their fates in its hands. Yet standing beside them were men whose very presence contradicted every warning, every caricature they had been fed. The ship groaned as it approached the harbor, gulls circling overhead, their cries mingling with the sharp scent of land, salt, oil, and coal carried on the breeze. One of the women, clutching her worn satchel tightly, leaned toward the nurse from Saipan and whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and wonder, "If they're not monsters, what are they?" It was a question heavy with uncertainty, a question that captured the turmoil in their hearts. The nurse had no answer, only silence, her eyes fixed on the American docks rising from the horizon, where more soldiers waited, tall, strong, and impeccably clean, their presence a further challenge to everything she had believed. Her pulse quickened, a rhythm of anticipation and unease. The journey across the ocean was ending, but a greater, more complex journey was only beginning. What awaited them on American soil was not the brutality they had feared, but something far stranger, perhaps even more unsettling, a world that would force them to confront the lies they had carried and the truths they would discover. The harbor emerged from the morning mist, its outline both a promise and a threat, a gateway to an unknown future. Wooden piers stretched like fingers into the water, cranes swung lazily overhead, and the air grew thick with the industrial smells of oil, salt, and coal as the ship eased closer to land. For the Japanese women on deck, every detail etched itself into their memories: the creak of the ship, the cry of the gulls, the distant hum of activity on the shore. They clutched their satchels tightly, their fingers gripping faded photographs and folded keepsakes, and peered through the fog at the figures gathering along the docks. Rows of American soldiers stood waiting, their uniforms immaculate, their rifles resting casually at their sides, their postures steady but devoid of cruelty. The women drew in sharp breaths, their first true glimpse of America shattering the images they had been fed. In Japan's wartime newspapers, the enemy had been depicted as hunched, bestial creatures with twisted, malicious faces, caricatures designed to inspire fear and hatred. Yet here, bathed in the soft sunlight of the harbor, the Americans stood tall, clean, and broad-shouldered, their hair gleaming in shades unfamiliar to the women: brown, blonde, even fiery red. Their jaws were sharp, their eyes startlingly clear, their bodies radiating a strength born of abundance, not scarcity. They did not look starved or sickly, they looked like men forged in a land of plenty, untouched by the hunger that had ravaged Japan. One young woman, her voice trembling as if confessing a forbidden truth, whispered to her companion, "They're handsome." The word felt dangerous, a betrayal of the loyalty instilled in her, as if acknowledging their humanity was a crime against her homeland. No one responded, but the silence carried a quiet agreement, a shared recognition that the men before them were not the monsters of their propaganda. The guards on the ship barked orders in English, their voices sharp but not cruel, signaling the women to prepare for disembarkation. The clang of boots on metal stairways echoed through the air, ropes tightened with a groan, and the ship shuddered as it pressed against the pier. One by one, the women descended the gangway, their heads bowed in a mix of shame and caution, though their eyes darted forward, stealing glances at the soldiers lining the path. The Americans towered over them, their height a stark contrast to the Japanese men of the 1940s, who averaged just over 5 feet 3 inches. These guards, nourished on diets of beef and milk, stood at 5 feet 8 inches or 5 feet 9 inches, some even taller, their presence imposing yet not threatening. The women felt the difference acutely, not just in physical stature, but in the easy confidence of their bearing, as if they belonged to a world where strength was a given. It was as though they had stepped into a land populated by giants, a place where everything felt larger, bolder, and more vibrant than they had ever known. The Americans watched in silence, some with curiosity in their eyes, others with a polite detachment that carried no malice. A few whispered among themselves, their words inaudible, but their tones free of mockery or scorn. One young soldier, no older than 20, shifted his weight nervously when a Japanese nurse glanced up at him, their gazes meeting for a fleeting moment. A flush of heat rose to her face, a mix of shame and confusion at noticing him in this moment of captivity. How could she see such things, a clean-shaven face, unscarred and impossibly youthful here, as a prisoner? She looked away quickly, but the image of his face lingered, seared into her thoughts like an unwelcome memory. At the foot of the gangway, the women were guided into orderly rows, their movements slow and deliberate under the watchful eyes of the Americans. Trucks waited nearby, their engines rumbling softly, ready to carry them inland to the camps that awaited. American officers moved among them, checking lists and counting heads with quiet efficiency, their clipboards a symbol of order in the chaos of war's aftermath. Yet beneath the clinical process, there was an unexpected thread of kindness. One officer gestured gently for a woman to adjust her satchel, ensuring it wouldn't slip from her shoulder, his hand careful not to touch her. Another spoke slowly, pointing to the truck she should board, his tone patient and measured, as if guiding a guest rather than a prisoner. These small gestures stood in stark contrast to the stories they had been told in Japan, where the enemy was said to spit on captives, treating them with less dignity than livestock. The women's hearts raced with the strangeness of it, their minds struggling to process a reality so at odds with their expectations. As the trucks jolted forward, the city unfolded before them like a scene from a dream. Wide streets stretched out, lined with towering warehouses and cranes that loomed against the sky. The air was streaked with the faint grit of industry, but between the haze, neon signs glowed with vibrant English letters, their colors dazzling to eyes unaccustomed to such brightness. Cars passed by, their engines purring smoothly, their chrome surfaces gleaming in the sunlight. America, even in a port still marked by the efforts of war, pulsed with life and vigor, a stark contrast to the devastation the women had left behind. In Japan, their cities lay in ruins, Tokyo reduced to fields of ash, Osaka scorched by firebombs, Nagoya shattered beyond recognition. Here, buildings stood tall and unbroken, and the rhythm of industry hummed as if the war had been a distant storm, brushing past without leaving its scars. The nurse from Saipan pressed her face to the slats of the truck bed, her eyes wide with astonishment. She thought of her younger brother, who had died of malnutrition 2 years earlier, his small frame wasted, his wrists thin, his eyes dulled by hunger. Then she looked again at the Americans driving the trucks, their broad backs, their thick arms, their laughter slipping easily between them like a shared secret. A knot of emotions twisted inside her, envy for their abundance, grief for her losses, and a reluctant wonder at the world they inhabited. If the enemy lived like this, thriving in a land untouched by scarcity, had they ever truly known the same war that had broken her homeland? The trucks rolled steadily inland toward the camps that would become their temporary home. Along the way, American civilians caught sight of the convoy, their reactions a mix of curiosity and restraint. Children stood barefoot at the roadside, waving with innocent enthusiasm, their faces alight with the novelty of the moment. The women shrank from their gazes, instinctively seeking to avoid attention, but what startled them most was not hatred or mockery, it was indifference. They were not spectacles to be paraded or jeered at, they were simply another fragment of the war's aftermath, a fleeting presence in a world moving forward. This anonymity brought a strange mix of relief and pain. Relief at being spared cruelty, but a sting at the reminder of their powerlessness, their identities reduced to mere passengers in a foreign land. Inside the truck, whispers spread among the women, their voices low but urgent. Then the 21-year-old clerk leaned toward the nurse, her breath warm against the cool air, and murmured, They look like film stars." Her eyes shone with nervous awe, a flicker of admiration she couldn't suppress. The nurse frowned, her instincts urging her to reject such thoughts, but she couldn't deny the truth in the younger woman's words. An older woman nearby hissed softly, "Don't talk like that," her tone sharp with disapproval, yet even she could not fully dismiss what they all felt. The men around them, clean, tall, and steady, were not the grotesque caricatures of their wartime propaganda. They were, in a way that unsettled them deeply, admirable, their presence a challenge to every belief they had held. The convoy reached the edges of the countryside, where the landscape opened into a breathtaking expanse of fields, green and golden under the warm sun. Farmhouses dotted the horizon, their porches adorned with rocking chairs that swayed gently in the breeze, their barns painted a vivid red that stood out against the rolling hills. The women stared in silence, their breath catching at the sight of a land so fertile, so untouched by the firebombs that had ravaged their own villages. This was America too, a place of abundance where the soil seemed to pulse with strength and possibility, a stark contrast to the scorched, empty landscapes they had left behind. The weight of that difference was unbearable, and some felt tears prick their eyes, though they quickly turned their faces away to hide their grief. By the time the truck slowed at the gates of the camp, the women's minds churned with a storm of contradictions. They had been told to expect cruelty, yet they had met with unexpected kindness. They had been warned of monstrous enemies, yet they found men who looked like athletes or actors, their vitality a silent rebuke to the lies of their propaganda. They had imagined America as a wasteland of arrogance and excess, but now they saw fields and cities untouched by the ruin that had consumed their homeland. Each glimpse of this abundance made their own losses feel heavier, more acute. Each tall, healthy soldier reminded them of brothers, fathers, and fiancés buried in shallow graves, their bodies worn thin by hunger and war. As they were led through the camp gates, a final moment struck them with piercing clarity. The American guards, waiting for orders, laughed among themselves, tossing a baseball back and forth with effortless grace. The ball arced high in the afternoon light, caught easily by hands that seemed unshaken by the horrors of war. The women paused, their eyes fixed on the scene, transfixed by its simplicity and its power. To them, it was more than a game. It was a vivid, almost cruel proof of America's enduring strength, a nation that had emerged from the war with its vigor intact, while Japan had crumbled into ashes. The nurse clutched her satchel tightly, her gaze locked on the ball as it sailed through the air once more. For the first time, she felt the full weight of the question clawing at their hearts. If everything they had believed about their enemy was false, what truths would this unfamiliar land force them to confront? What lay inside the camp would challenge them even more than the sight of handsome men on the docks, for it would force them to redefine not only their enemy, but themselves. The gates clanged shut behind them, but the camp was not the grim, oppressive prison they had imagined. It stretched across rolling fields, its wooden huts arranged in neat rows like barns in a prosperous village, their roofs sturdy and their walls clean. The fences were tall but not menacing, more a boundary than a cage, and the guards patrolled the perimeter with rifles resting lazily on their shoulders, their expressions more bored than brutal. The women clutched their satchels and stepped onto gravel paths that crunched underfoot, their hearts pounding with disbelief at the order and cleanliness that surrounded them. They had braced themselves for darkness, for cruelty, for cages that would strip them of dignity. Instead, they found a place that smelled faintly of baking bread, the aroma drifting from a kitchen where warmth and sustenance awaited. On the first morning, they were woken not by harsh shouts, but by the clear, resonant chime of a bell, like a schoolyard signal calling children to class. They lined up hesitantly for breakfast, their movements tentative, their eyes scanning for signs of danger. But when the trays arrived, piled with scrambled eggs, thick slices of buttered bread, and even strips of sizzling bacon, the younger women stared in stunned silence, unable to believe such abundance was meant for them. The nurse from Saipan leaned toward the young clerk beside her and whispered, "This would feed a family for a week in Tokyo." The clerk only nodded, her eyes brimming with tears, her throat tight with emotion. For months, they had survived on thin rice gruel or boiled weeds, their bodies accustomed to hunger. Here, in the land of their conquerors, they were handed more than they had dared to dream possible. Some wept silently as they ate, their tears born not of cruelty, but of a kindness so overwhelming it felt like a betrayal of their own suffering. Life in the camp settled into a strange, almost surreal rhythm, governed by a schedule that brought order to their days: meals, roll calls, medical checks, and optional work details for those who chose to participate. The women were given plain uniforms, not degrading but practical, sturdy enough for chores like cleaning or gardening. They were housed in separate barracks from the men, their quarters lined with simple wooden bunks and thin mattresses that, while not luxurious, offered a stability they hadn't known in years. At night, the darkness was filled with whispers, stories of husbands lost in battle, brothers who had marched into jungles and never returned, children left behind in a homeland now reduced to rubble. Beneath their grief, a constant astonishment pulsed. Why were they being treated with such dignity in the land of their enemies? The Americans, too, seemed uncertain, navigating their roles with a cautious politeness. Guards handed out bars of soap, showed the women where the showers were, and explained, sometimes with clumsy hand gestures, how to use unfamiliar fixtures. One soldier chuckled softly when a woman stared in awe at hot water gushing from a tap, saying, "It's just plumbing," unaware that to her, it was a miracle after years of rationing and scarcity. Another time, when a woman struggled to carry a heavy crate during a work detail, a guard stepped forward, taking it from her hands with a sheepish smile, his movements careful and unthreatening. Afterward, she whispered to her companions, "I thought he would strike me." Instead, he helped. These small, human interactions chipped away at the beliefs they had clung to, forcing them to question truths they had once thought unshakable. Not every moment was gentle, of course. The women were still prisoners, their movements restricted, their lives under constant surveillance. The tall fences loomed as a reminder of their captivity, and the guards' rifles, though carried casually, were never far from reach. Yet cruelty was not the defining feature of the camp. Instead, it was a strange blend of abundance and restraint, as if the Americans had chosen to express their victory not through punishment, but through demonstrations of their own strength, feeding their enemies, housing them in clean quarters, allowing them to work with a semblance of purpose. These acts were subtle assertions of power, gestures that seemed to say, "We are strong enough to be merciful." One warm afternoon, the women were gathered in the camp's yard, watching as American soldiers tossed a baseball back and forth, their laughter ringing out like music in the air. The women were transfixed by the ease of it, the way the ball sailed in perfect arcs, caught with a confidence that spoke of lives untouched by hunger or destruction. In Japan, their brothers had played with makeshift bats and balls fashioned from scraps of cloth, games born of necessity in a land stripped bare by war. Here the game was effortless, woven into the fabric of daily life for men who seemed to carry no scars of famine or defeat. The young clerk whispered to her friend, "It's like watching another world." She was right. The camp was less a prison than a mirror, reflecting the vast divide between their shattered homeland and this place of enduring strength. The nurse from Saipan found herself studying the guards when they weren't looking, her eyes tracing their sunburned faces, sometimes speckled with freckles, their jaws square and strong, their teeth startlingly white compared to the malnourished men she had cared for in field hospitals. She thought of her fiancé, who had sailed to war in 1943 and never returned, his body thin, his skin sallow, his shoulders narrowed by hunger. The men before her now seemed like giants, their vitality a painful contrast to the fragility of those she had lost. She hated herself for noticing, for letting her gaze linger on their healthy forms, yet she could not stop. The difference was a wound that refused to heal, a constant reminder of all that had been taken from her. The Americans received letters in neat stacks, delivered with the regularity of a world still connected by love and hope. The women watched as soldiers unfolded envelopes, their faces softening with smiles or glistening with quiet tears before they tucked photographs into their breast pockets. For the Americans, family seemed close, a living presence even across oceans. For the Japanese women, family was a fading memory, their loved ones unreachable, lost to war or distance. That divide felt sharper than the barbed wire of the camp's fences, a barrier no less real for its intangibility. Yet, amidst the sorrow, small connections began to bloom, fragile but undeniable. When a woman thanked a soldier in halting, broken English for an extra bar of soap, he responded with exaggerated politeness, tipping his cap as if addressing a lady at a formal gathering. She laughed despite herself, the sound surprising her, the first laughter she had allowed since her capture. Another day, when a sudden storm swept through the camp, the guards rushed to secure windows and roofs, one shouting instructions as if protecting his own home from the wind's wrath. The women joined in, hauling boards and supplies, their hands working alongside those of their captors in a shared urgency. For a brief moment, the lines between prisoner and guard blurred, and they were simply people fighting a common enemy, the storm. The memory of that moment lingered, a quiet testament to the humanity that persisted despite the war's divisions. Reports from the International Red Cross, though unseen by the women, noted the unusual fairness of American POW camps, contrasting them sharply with the brutal conditions of Japanese camps across Asia, where disease and cruelty were rampant. The women did not read these documents, but they lived their truth every day. Each bar of soap, each plate of food, each simple act of kindness stood as evidence against the propaganda that had shaped their understanding of the enemy. The lies they had been fed crumbled quietly, replaced by experiences they could not deny. Yet this transformation was not without pain. Each glimpse of American strength, the well-fed bodies, the clean uniforms, the easy laughter, was also a reminder of Japan's ruin. Their homeland lay in ashes, its cities reduced to rubble, its people struggling to survive on scraps. Brothers and fathers had died gaunt and broken, their bodies worn by hunger and war. To see their captors thrive while their own kin perished was an agony that settled deep in their bones, a grief they carried like a second skin. Gratitude for the kindness they received lived alongside resentment for their defeat, two truths that coexisted in uneasy tension, both heavy, both undeniable. The nurse from Saipan once stood by the fence, watching a guard write a letter home, his pencil moving steadily across the page, his lips forming silent words. When he paused, gazing toward the horizon, she wondered who he wrote to: a wife waiting in a distant town, a sweetheart dreaming of his return, a mother praying for his safety. She thought of the letters she would never write, the faces she would never see again, the voices silenced by war. A bitter truth struck her with sudden clarity. This man, her captor, might know more joy and peace in his lifetime than her fiancé ever had the chance to experience. She turned away quickly, but the thought lingered, a haunting presence that followed her through the days. As the seasons turned, the echoes of war softened into the distant memories, and the women began to mark time less by fear and more by the small rituals that gave shape to their days. They swept their barracks with care, folded their uniforms with precision, tended to each other when illness struck, their hands gentle with shared understanding. Some worked in the camp's gardens, planting rows of vegetables under the watchful eyes of the guards, their fingers sinking into the soil with a reverence that felt like reclaiming life itself. The act of planting, of nurturing growth in a place of confinement, gave rhythm to days that might otherwise have blurred into monotony. Yet always above these routines loomed the tall figures of the American soldiers, their presence a constant reminder that the world was not what they had been taught. One afternoon, a soldier carried a phonograph into the yard, setting it down with a grin. When he cranked it, music poured out, brassy, swinging rhythms that filled the air with an infectious energy. The women froze, startled by the unfamiliar, vibrant sound, so different from the somber melodies of their homeland. Some smiled despite themselves, their lips curving upward in a reflex they couldn't control. A few guards clapped in time, joking with one another, their voices light and carefree. The nurse closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her, and felt tears burn at the corners of her eyes. Music, of all things, reminded her that joy could still exist, even in captivity. Its beauty was almost cruel, a stark contrast to the pain she carried, yet it etched itself into her memory as a moment when the walls of enmity cracked wide enough to let something human slip through. By spring, whispers of release began to spread through the camp, carried on the warm breezes that replaced winter's frost. The war was long over, and the prospect of repatriation loomed, a bittersweet promise of return to a homeland forever changed. For many of the women, the thought of going home was both a longing and a fear. They yearned for the familiarity of Japan, yet dreaded the ruins they would find, the rubble, hunger, and grief that awaited. News trickled in, fragmented reports of a nation reshaped by defeat, its cities reduced to ash, its people struggling to rebuild. To leave the camp meant to face that reality, to step out from the strange shelter of their captivity into a world that might be harsher still. For some, the fences had come to feel not only like a prison, but also like a paradoxical refuge, a place where they were fed, clothed, and treated with a dignity they had not expected. When the day of departure arrived, the women gathered their belongings, folding their issued coats and tying their bundles with care. They lined up once more for transport, their steps slow, their faces a mix of anticipation and apprehension. The nurse from Saipan paused, turning to look back at the camp one final time. The barracks stood quietly, their wooden walls weathered but sturdy, the fences still tall, the guards still watching with their casual vigilance. Yet in her memory, it was not the fences that stood out, nor the confinement they represented. It was the smell of sizzling bacon in the mornings, the warmth of hot showers after years of cold scarcity, the polite gestures of soldiers who treated them as humans, the sight of tall men tossing a baseball under the sun's golden light. These details, so vivid and unexpected, would travel with her long after the gates closed behind her, imprinted on her heart like a map of a world she had never imagined. As the trucks rumbled toward the port, the women whispered to one another, their voices soft but heavy with meaning. "Not monsters, but men," one said, echoing the words that had first stirred them on the ship. "They looked like film stars," another added, her tone free of the shame that had once accompanied such thoughts. "They treated us better than we ever expected," a third murmured, her words a quiet acknowledgement of the truth they had all come to see. The nurse remained silent, her eyes fixed on the road stretching ahead, her mind grappling with a shift she could feel but not fully name. It was not love for her captors, nor admiration in the way one might admire a hero. It was something heavier, more profound, a recognition that the world was far more complex than she had ever been taught, that truth was not a single story but a tapestry woven from countless threads. The war had been built on lies, but in the strange confines of captivity, she had glimpsed something undeniable, something real. At the harbor, the ships waited, their gray hulls looming like silent giants, ready to carry them back to the ashes of Japan. The women climbed aboard, their satchels clutched tightly, their hearts torn between the longing for home and the weight of what they were leaving behind. As America receded into the distance, it remained a land of contradiction, a place of defeat and unexpected mercy, of tall, handsome men who had shattered every story they had been told about the enemy. The ship's engines roared to life, a deep rumble that vibrated through the deck, and the nurse pressed her hands together, her fingers trembling as she whispered a prayer. It was not a prayer for victory, nor for revenge, but for understanding, a plea to make sense of the truths she had encountered and the questions that still lingered. She did not yet know what awaited her in Japan, a homeland scarred and broken. But she carried one certainty with her, a truth that would remain etched in her soul. The enemy had looked into her eyes and seen her as human, and that memory, both painful and luminous, would never fade.